Video games. Everybody has played at least one in their lifetime. Whether you were just messing around in Super Mario Bros. Or sweating trying to beat a boss in Elden Ring. As you guys might know, Elden Ring and Super Mario Bros. Are completely different games. One is ridiculously difficult, and the other is a lighter experience and is often one of the first video games people will play in their lifetime. They do have one major factor in common though. They were both developed by Japanese companies, Nintendo and From Software. This got me thinking about how many video games in the US were actually developed in Japan. The companies Nintendo and From Software were founded and are still based in Japan today. So are all of these companies. Has it always been this way? I decided to look into the history of video games to figure that out. Here we go. To answer this question, we're going to have to go all the way back to 1966. There was this guy. He was working for a company called Sanders Associates Inc. And his name was Ralph Baer. Ralph had a lot of computer experience from his work with Sanders Associates and was very interested in how they work. Ralph knew that the television also had limitless potential and could be used for more than just sitting there and watching TV. So from 1966 to 1968, he and some buddies started working on a multiplayer game system. This would become the Brown Box, the first working video game system. Later, Ralph would end up selling the rights for his work to Magnavox. Magnavox would use Ralph's work to create the Magnavox Odyssey. The Magnavox Odyssey is considered to be the first home video game system because it's the first console that released with cartridges. Cartridges are, of course, the things that the game play off of. Although there is one main factor that kept consumers from falling in love with the system. The games were too similar. Almost all games involved a ball bouncing between two things, similar to Pong, but not precisely. However, the games would go on to inspire Atari's Pong later that same year. The Magnavox Odyssey would fail to catch on, and would only go on to sell 350,000 units. This would be considered a commercial flop. One other major flaw I had failed to mention up to this point. Magnavox just didn't market the thing. Only a handful of commercials were made, and they wouldn't run often. They did, though, do an excellent job of telling you what the console did, although they didn't do it in a fun way. Here, let me show you what I mean.
Magnavox presents Odyssey, the electronic game of the future. Odyssey easily attaches to any brand TV, black and white or color, to create a closed-circuit electronic playground. Odyssey gives you all the exciting action of hockey and 11 other challenging play and learning games for the entire family. Odyssey, a new dimension for your television, now at your Magnavox dealer. He's listed in the yellow pages.
See what I mean? It's practically just a guy telling you what the machine does. That doesn't get the kids as excited as other video game commercials would do, as we'll later see. In 1972, Nolan Bushnell founded the American company Atari. Nolan would release the game Pong in the same year, and suddenly, Atari was a hit in the arcades. They would continue to release hit after hit after hit. Atari wondered, how could we take the success into the home? The answer to this question would be the Atari 2600. The Atari 2600 did well in its first year, selling 400,000 units. It sold 500,000 in 1978 and 1 million in 1979. Things really started to pick up in 1980 with the release of the home version of Space Invaders. Space Invaders was a massive hit in arcades and would be a significant factor in why the Atari 2600 sold so well. The 2600 sold 2 million units in 1980, with 1 million units of Space Invaders being sold. Half of the people who bought the 2600 that year also bought Space Invaders. In the US, the 2600 sold 10 million units by 1982, and the best-selling game was Pac-Man, with 7 million copies sold. This is incredible when you think about it, because roughly 70% of all owners of a 2600 had Pac-Man. Space Invaders was a game that propelled the 2600 to popularity, but Pac-Man was the game that launched it to superstardom. Atari also did very well because its marketing was much better than Magnavox. Atari's commercials were fun for kids, with fun graphics and even a jingle at the end. Here is my favorite commercial that they made.
Those old reruns keep your family apart. Does your dog fall asleep at the very start? Then turn off the TV. And here's what you will see when you play a game from Atari. Have you played Atari today?
With an Atari game, a flick of the switch turns your TV set into a playground and your family room into a family room.
Have you played Atari today?
See how kids would want that compared to the Magnavox? With all of these factors, Atari would reach heights no video game company had ever experienced. Although, as some of you probably know, things would soon change for Atari. In 1982, the video game industry was riding high. Everything was going well for Atari, but that would soon start to change. Problems would begin to rise. Atari had been selling some pretty crappy games, although this itself wasn't the big problem. Atari had been selling these crappy games with realistic looking artwork on the cover. This would cause the consumer to think that the game looked amazing when it really didn't. The number of games sold started to decline, causing Atari to plummet in sales, triggering the beginning of the video game crash. There was one last nail in the coffin though. E.T. the Extraterrestrial was released in 1982 and was the highest grossing movie of all time as of 1982. Atari saw the success and wanted to make a game about the film. Atari had already worked with the director, Steven Spielberg, to make a game for the movie Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Atari called on the same team that they had worked with on Indiana Jones to make E.T. Negotiations about how much money Spielberg would get lasted until the end of July. This caused Atari to make the game in a concise amount of time, that is, 5 weeks. You might not understand how short that is. Games back then would take about a year to make, nowhere close to 5 weeks. The game was released in December 1982, and at first it was a huge success. They had sold about 2.6 million copies before the end of the month. Atari, though, had gone way in over their heads and expected it to sell about triple this. Word would get out about how bad the game was as well. With the game being made in only 5 weeks, there was a game-breaking bug causing the game to be almost unplayable. In the game, players would have to retrieve parts of E.T.'s machine to phone home. They would do this by falling into random pits, hoping there was a piece in it. The players would try to escape the pit, but there was a very high chance that they would spawn right back on top of the pit and fall back in. Because of this, sales would start to plummet, and Atari would have so many unsold copies of the game that I'm not kidding here, they would be forced to bury unsold copies of the game in the desert. The video game industry really started to fall apart in 1983, going from $3 billion of profit in 82 to only $100 million in 83. For more perspective, the Atari 2600, released in 1977, sold 30 million units in its lifespan. The Atari 5200, released in 1982, sold just over 1 million units. People during this time would not buy new games and would just play the games that they already owned, causing the video game industry to crumble apart, and its future looked bleak. Alright, so we're going to take a step away and talk about the video game industry in Japan. Japan got a later start to video games than America did. In 1978, Star Wars was released in theaters, causing an interest in space in Japan. Space Invaders would be released 3 weeks later, causing the first big boom of video games. Arcades started to open everywhere, and there was even a rumor that Japanese people played Space Invaders so much there was a shortage of 100 yen coins. In the same year, 1977, Nintendo started to develop the Color TV line of video game consoles. The catch with them was that you could only play one game on each of them, examples being Pong and Breakout. Pac-Man would go on to release in 1980, which would only make interest in video games boom. Pac-Man was so famous that it was believed to have been played over 10 billion times in the 20th century. Remember that Nintendo company? Well, they wanted to take the next step and start releasing video games as their primary source of revenue. They started releasing arcade games, but they were unsuccessful. In 1980, they thought they had a hit. It was called Radar Scope, although it was pretty much a Space Invaders clone. To Nintendo's surprise, Radar Scope was a flop. They didn't sell many cabinets and had nothing to do with the unsold cabinets. This was until Nintendo developed the game Donkey Kong. Just one problem: what do they do with the unsold cabinets of Radarscope? Then they had an idea: turn the cabinets of Radarscope into cabinets for Donkey Kong. This plan succeeded, and Donkey Kong was a huge hit in arcades. Nintendo would go on to release many more arcade games until they wanted to take the next step. Nintendo wanted to release a home video game console. They already had experience with the color TV line of systems, although this time they wanted to release something like the Atari 2600, a console they would release once with interchangeable cartridges. They would do this with the Family Computer, or Famicom for short. Released on July 15, 1983, the Famicom was Nintendo's first home video game console. It was especially good at playing games right out of the arcade, providing the best quality arcade experiences in the home at the time. Guess what? The Famicom was a huge success. At one point, 37% of all Japanese households had a Famicom. This was partly because of the arcade games, but also because of the fantastic library of Nintendo's original games. Some of the most popular include Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, and Metroid. The Famicom would continue to be produced until 2003, becoming one of the longest living consoles ever, although most people probably know the Famicom by another name. The year is 1984, and Nintendo is riding high off of the success of the Famicom in Japan. They wanted to capitalize on this success and bring the console to America. There was just one problem with this plan. Remember the video game crash? Well, it was still going on. Nobody in America was willing to buy video games anymore, and Nintendo knew this. They knew they would have to get creative in selling their console. Nintendo's first plan was to partner with the industry leader at the time, Atari. Nintendo's contract with Atari required them to produce the console and make at least 4 games. Atari didn't like this contract because they did all the work while barely getting any credit. They also had a lot of support behind the Atari 7200, which they thought would be the console to revive the industry. It would end up flopping. With this news, Nintendo would now be on its own. They already had some experience in the North American market with their Game & Watch pocket handhelds, but nowhere close to how much experience they would need to market their Famicom. They threw around multiple ideas, but they ultimately decided to market the console not like a video game console, but like a toy. Nintendo would take an early version of the American Famicom to a business convention. It would receive interest, but no one was willing to invest in it. Investors saw right through Nintendo's plan. They noticed that it was just a video game system and were reluctant that it would sell. The American Famicom was already being sold with a toy gun, but they needed to take it further to convince people that it was a toy. This is when Nintendo of Japan started developing a toy robot to play games with you. The robot would end up being named Rob, or Robotic Operating Buddy. Rob was the ultimate trick. Nintendo could use Rob to trick people into thinking that it was a toy. Nintendo would take Rob and the American Famicom to another business convention. It received more interest and press than it did the last time, although investors were still skeptical about putting money into what was more or less a video game console. Nintendo decided that they were going to soft launch the Japanese Famicom in New York City and see how it would perform. This meant they had to get everything ready for release, including the console's name. Nintendo would choose the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short. Nintendo also made sure that they didn't use the words video games anywhere on the packaging or in advertisements. The deal with retailers was that Nintendo would stock the shelves at stores, and if the NES didn't sell in 90 days, they could ship it back to Nintendo. Nintendo would hold a launch party for the NES on October 18, 1985. Despite being invited, no press showed up for the launch party. Even without the additional advertising, the NES was a huge success. It launched for $159.95. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $320 today. The deluxe set included the NES, 2 controllers, the NES Zapper, Rob, the game Gyromite, which was for use with Rob, and the game Duck Hunt, which was for use with the NES Zapper. 15 other games were also available for purchase separately for $34.95 each. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $110 today. As mentioned earlier, the NES was a huge success. It flew off the shelves as soon as new shipments got in. Nintendo would launch the console across the entire United States in 1986, and the country loved it. The advertising was marketed towards kids, causing it to be one of the most requested Christmas presents in 1986. Here is probably their most famous commercial with their most famous catchphrase.
When you get hold of the Nintendo Entertainment System, when you master Rob the video robot, and meet the challenge of Gyromite. When you shoot the light-sensing zapper, when you play the system with the most arcade hits, you're playing with power. The Nintendo Entertainment System. Now you're playing with power.
Doesn't that just really make you want to buy an NES? The NES also had many measures to ensure it didn't recreate the video game crash of '83. The most prominent was the lockout chip. This was a chip that only Nintendo could produce and attached to the motherboards of each game. This meant that Nintendo would have to hand-pick each game produced on the console. Of course, some games of lesser quality would still end up on the console, but not nearly as many as the Atari 2600 had. The NES would end up selling over 60 million copies in its lifetime. Nintendo would also be credited with saving the video game industry, and many people believe that without them, video games would not be nearly as mainstream as they are today. Nintendo is still one of the primary producers of video games to this day, and many other Japanese companies have followed in their footsteps coming over to America. Japan is the video game industry leader right now by a pretty wide margin. Two of the leading producers of video games, Nintendo and Sony, are Japanese companies. I, and most other people, don't see this changing in the near future. Personally, my favorite video games right now are the ones coming out of Japan. Nintendo just happens to be my favorite video game company, hence why this project exists. I am very interested to see if Japan will remain the industry leader in 20 years, or if America can retake the throne. Hey, I just want to say thanks for watching. This was very fun to make, and I just want to say thank you to my teachers in school for letting me make such a fun project in school. Yeah, this was pretty much my first attempt at doing anything like this, and I had a blast doing it, so I just want to say thanks for watching, and I hope you all enjoyed, and maybe we'll see you next time, I don't know.